It is on. Can you hear me now? We're going to we just have a short agenda tonight because I want to spend most of the time to have our very own John Harris here. And but if we can start off, Donnie, would you start with the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great. So the only part of business order that we have tonight is to just let everybody know that we'll be having our normal quarterly business meeting next week on Thursday at 6 o'clock, and that's here. It's open to the public if you want to fall asleep, but you're more than welcome to come to it. So with that said, keep in mind that this is 2024, and we have the sincere honor and privilege of being about the closest thing that we'll ever be to John Harris. David Biser, who I thank you very much for being here tonight, is the recreation, or I know he's a reenactor, but he's definitely fits the part and is an expert on the subject. So I would like to welcome John Harris.
I am most honored, sir. Thank you. And it is most pleasing to hear that politics have not changed one iota in that people still fall asleep. Yes. I recall Mr. Franklin being asleep several times in session. And so, yes, good evening to everyone. Good evening. Good. You're awake and alive. So I often have school children ask me how old I am. So, well, the answer is that I allow them to do the work themselves. I was born in 1727, so I let them do the math. Most of them, at least one in the room, can figure it out. Usually, most definitely. I want to thank you for your presence this evening. I am honored to be here. Quite honestly, I am overwhelmed at the thought that someone would want to listen to a person like myself, who has lived quite a long time ago. And I would think that by now, in your day, I hear that the year is what? Would you remind me again, sir?
2024.
2024, that I would be irrelevant. But I am pleased to know, by the smiles on your face and your presence here in this place, that obviously history is still of interest to people. Whether was Washington reading Cicero or you listening to the history of your own region, I'm quite honored to be present with you. So let me just say this. It has been a rather busy day, has it not? I don't know about you, but it is the spring of the year. And 2 months ago, I was at my leisure. But now we have garden to put in. Of course, we have 300 acres. We have fruit trees, apple, pear, cherry trees, cherry bounce, by the way. Anyway, so we have all the trees to mend and make sure that they're in a good shape and all trimmed properly. And so we have, there's a good catch in the river right now. Running, and so it's important when there's a good catch running, we catch as much as we can, and then we salt barrel them. And so that means we fillet the fish down and place it in barrels and with layers of salt so that they would be preserved. And so it is a busy season, to say the least. But it has not been the first time that you or I have been in busy seasons, is it not? Right. We have all experienced busyness in our lives, and whether it's busyness due to business or busyness due to family, whatever it might be, we all have found our situation to be in such that there are not enough hours in a day. And so Mr. Franklin, God bless him, is arguing for this thing called daylight savings, so that we might have more hours in the day. I am well aware of the science of the matter, but I must admit to you, I'm up when the sun is up and I'm down when the sun is down. That's all that matters to me. If I have to be somewhere and someone says, well, you need to be there at such and such an hour, then I shall keep the clock with me as I do tonight. I think I shall be aware of the time this evening, or we should talk all night long, I promise you. Although I was assured that there is no ale in the building. And so if we're going to talk past dark, we must go to a tavern. So that being said, someone like that, right? That being said, I found myself in a situation, one of the making of my father, and then one of my own making. The making of my father happened in the 40s when my father passed away suddenly, and I inherited all of his worldly goods, all of his property, the home that we had there on the Susquehanna River, the servants that he owned, all of the goods, the trading house, his licensure, which he received in the 30s, his licensure to trade with the natives, his license to run a trading post, his license to ferry people back and forth across the river. So all of that, everything came to me. I was all of 21 years old, yes, in 1740 and 8 when my father passed on. And so immediately I did what any good young red-blooded man would do. I found myself a wife. Right, I needed help immediately. My two older sisters were already married, one living here in Harris's Ferry and the other living in Carlisle with her husband. My three younger brothers, though, were a handful, and I was given, by the document, by the will of my father, I was given full responsibility of my three younger brothers. And so I was to educate them, make sure that they were set in life, and to make sure that they would be established. You see, in my day, being the oldest son, everything came to me. And then I was given responsibility to care for my family. So there I was with the log home, the tavern, the trading post, the ferry. At that point, there was 800 acres on both sides of the river that I owned, all of a sudden, right? 300 that my father had gotten by charter from Mr. Penn when he came here in the early 1700s. And then he had added an additional 300 acres and then several more acres, 100 acres. And so we were at 800 acres at that point. Several hundred acres under great contest, by the way, from the Shawnee. Chief Shikellamy had gone down to Philadelphia and argued. My father wanted to put a trading post at some of the land that we owned where the Juniata flows into the Susquehanna. Are you familiar with the area? Right, yes. Well, there's a Shawnee village there, and so Shikellamy petitioned the government and said, Mr. Harris shall not build a trading post on our land. And they won the day. It was a time, and quite honestly, many of you understand this, so I'm not telling you something you don't already know, but it was a time of tenseness between the natives and the Pennsylvania government. And so the Pennsylvania government decided to throw Chief Shikellamy a bone and tell my father he wasn't allowed to put a trading post on the land up there. Those are the kinds of things that were happening. And then in just after our first daughter was born, her name was Mary, to me and my wife Elizabeth. McClure was her last name. Elizabeth McClure was my wife, and we had a daughter, Mary. And then the government asked, Pennsylvania government, working under, of course, the understanding of being a part of Great Britain, one of the colonies, asked me to go west. In 1753, I got the documentation that I was to take adventure all the way out to what is known as Logstown in my day. Let me see if I can give a spot. Well, Fort Pitt sits at the confluence of the three rivers, correct? So just north of there is Logstown. And it's an Indian settlement of about 2,000 natives who live there. It literally is it's a small town. And I was asked to venture to Logstown and back by 2 different routes, keeping track of all of the distances all the way out and all the way back. But I was to also reconnoiter the position of the French. For you see, in 1754, the French had started an incursion all the way down through New York and had managed to come into Pennsylvania and had established what would be a fort, Duquesne, there at the Three Rivers. And so I was sent west, marking every trip, every mileage I could, and keeping note of all the distances that I trekked all the way out to Logstown, going on the northern route up by Raystown. I think nowadays you call it Lewistown, but up Raystown and on the northern extent all the way out to Logstown, and then back what would eventually become, well, it was an Indian trail then, but would eventually become Braddock's Road. And so I made my way back that way. Well, and on my way back, I do attest to you that I ran into 2 individuals who I knew quite well. This is early in '54, and so February, as a matter of fact. And so I ran into 2 individuals, a fellow by the name of Krogan, who is a trader like myself with Indians and such, and then one of the native chiefs named Half King. And Half King and Krogan had been hired by this Virginian who was on a trek from the governor of Virginia to see what was going on in the western frontier of Pennsylvania, which of course Virginia thinks it owns part of western Pennsylvania at the time. Virginia thinks it owns everything. Let's just be honest, right? You know the Virginians. Dinwiddie thought he owned everything all the way to the other ocean, I swear. And so he sends this lieutenant colonel, a young fellow named Washington. And Washington had hired Krogan and Half King as his guides. Well, I knew Krogan and Half King, so I stopped and chatted with the 2 of them, but I didn't know this Washington fellow for nothing. Some young upstart lieutenant colonel from Virginia, who is he? And so I moved on and they moved on, and well, in that expedition they would start the French and Indian War. Half King burying a tomahawk into the French commander's Jumonville's head, which, by the way, the French did not like that at all. Washington standing by and watching all of the affair. Half King would later that year, in October of that year, manage to make his way back to my house. Washington got himself in quite a predicament, to say the least, for necessity and the mess that was happening on the western frontier, and Washington right in the middle of all of it. Half King would leave him in a situation of illness and by his family be brought to my house, where he would die. His request was, if I am to die, I shall die at Harris's house. Half King and I knew each other that well, and the natives were incredibly comfortable to be at my house. Several treaties happened there at my house. Conrad Weiser, I don't know if you are familiar maybe with Mr. Weiser, was oftentimes the linguist as the translator. He was fluent in multiple Indian languages. It was just amazing how quickly he could pick up a native tongue and be able to converse with the natives. So Weiser would often come to my house. With the lieutenant governor would manage to make his way there, and then we would call in the chiefs from all the tribes: the Seneca, the Shawnee, the Onondaga, the Iroquois, the Lenni Lenape, the Delaware. The list is long. At one point, I had 160 natives resting in my home. Have you ever smelled bear grease? It is one of the most foul things in the world, and they pigment it with different herbs and roots and such to make war paint. And so, but in the summer, they rub it all over themselves to keep them from being bitten by the mosquitoes. It is the foulest smell. It is a rotten stench. It forced me to sit down at my writing desk, of which I am quite proud, by the way, sit down at my writing desk and write to the governor and ask him to send troops that he might remove them by force, for they were not leaving my home. When requested to leave, they refused. They said, "We are most comfortable here." Yes. Can you imagine 160 natives in your front yard? No. None of us can imagine such an affair. And yet there it was. Every time I woke up in the morning, there they were. Every time I went to bed at night, there they were. Men, women, children, fishing, hunting, so on. We ate well. I shall say that. We ate rather well. But all of that being said, the French and Indian War did wreak an incredible havoc on our colony, as you are quite aware. As a matter of fact, at one point, Penn's massacre had taken place, and I rallied almost 50 men on horseback of the militia, and we went to see if we could find this band of renegade Indians who were performing these raids, in which we are in mixed company of children and women. So, gentlemen, abide with me that I shall not go in great detail, but the massacre was grotesque, to say the least. On purpose. The natives, on purpose, were brutal beyond imagination. Hence the term savage, in which I often refer to those renegades who would do such brutality to the human body. And so we went and buried those who were left behind. Several had been captured and taken off. If you were not aware, 600 individuals are captured during the French and Indian War. Under Bouquet, we will get about 300 of them back. That's it. That's amazing, right? Several of them from right here. You're familiar with Fort Barnett, just out the road, and the raid that happened there, Manada Fort, and we have had many children and women captured here in our own area. And so our goal was to enter into treaty with the natives and to push the French out. Well, that was a mess. My own brother was a teamster on the wagon train with Forbes' expedition. Samuel, he was he could drive a wagon, and so they recruited him. When Forbes went west to push the French finally out of Fort Duquesne, they crossed at my ferry. The Highlanders, 400 of them, the Highlanders, are you familiar with the Scots? Right, Scots Highlanders. The English Forbes had brought them with him. And so there are 400 Highlanders of the Royal Regiment, and these men are ruthless. They were the right men to be chosen. But they walked across the river. And then we carried all of the horses and the baggage and the cannon and such on my ferry boats across the river for the Forbes expedition. And so I began to recognize the importance and significance of our position here. My father had recognized it long ago when asked to come by Mr. Penn himself, asked to come and create a settlement here on the Susquehanna River with the potential of being the second most beautiful city in all of the colony of Pennsylvania. You know the first one, Philadelphia, right? Of course. But the goal of Mr. Penn was to have a second most beautiful city here on the Susquehanna. And so my father was willing and was sent to find a place. He had originally settled up at where is now Mr. Clark has a ferry north of what is now Harrisburg. But realizing that the native trail came further south and then crossed the river right here, because just below the Big Island, I think you call it City Island, but in my day it's Big Island, it's the Big Island, right? Just below, south, on the southern side of Big Island, there is a flat shelf of rock that runs east shore to west shore and back underneath the Susquehanna River. And you can walk across on this flat shelf of rock, or even better yet, you can navigate flat-bottom Durham boats on this with very little necessity of water, 2 or 3 feet at best. and you can travel from East Shore to West Shore and back. And so it was the perfect spot for my father when he realized that this was the place that the natives were crossing. And having been given the task of trading with the natives, he decided that it was important, most significant, to set up his encampment and his home and his trading post where the natives would cross. And so here we are now, French and Indian War being over. We are in a time, well, Pontiac has done his damage. Quite honestly, it was almost as devastating as the French and Indian War to have Pontiac's rebellion follow it so closely afterwards, the Ohio chief who decided that, well, even though we had settled and there was peace now, that he was not finished and he was going to continue the war. The Pennsylvania government at that moment made a decision that you might find grotesque, you might find abhorrent to your sensitivities in your modern day, but the Pennsylvania government put a bounty on Indian scalps. Yes. 150 Spanish real dollars for a male scalp. That's a year's wages. 100 Spanish real dollars for a female scalp, and 50 real dollars for a child. And so, as amazing as that might sound to our sensitivities in our modern day, in my day, it is a reality that an Indian who has gone off the reservation, so to speak, as you might say in your day, an Indian who has decided against his own tribe to do damage to the relationship between the white man and the native. These band of natives, frontiersmen were out hunting them. They would bring the scalps to me. I would purchase them for, of course, a lesser amount. And then I would take them to Philadelphia and get full cost. Because my position, not only in the trade of scalps, which only lasted for about a year, but I also do trade in furs, of which I did bring a few with me this evening, in case you might be interested, this being the most coveted fur. Are you familiar with this one? Ah, yes, beaver, right, yes, indeed. Deer, we're shipping deer to England and to France. They come, and I purchase everything at my trading post, and then I take it down to Philadelphia on pack horses. Or I've commissioned 2 Conestoga wagons to be built for myself because of the necessity of trade. But there are lots of other animals here on the frontier. This being a fox. Yes, that's a red fox. Raccoon. This is a bobcat. There's a raccoon. You can always tell by the tail, right? Yes. So there are days when I have mounds of furs at my home. The natives or frontiersmen have brought, because there then I pay, most oftentimes not in cash, not in any kind of ready money, but in goods, tomahawks, flints, pots, pans, bolts of fabric, something that somebody on the frontier might want. Natives have no real need for cash or ready money, coinage. They have no need for that, nor does a frontiersman living on the frontier. They do have need for ready goods, things that they can trade with others or utilize themselves. And so I'm always in the condition and position of bartering and trading back and forth. One of my favorite things right now to trade is tobacco. Oh, it is. The natives use it, and so do we but England loves American tobacco. So we ship it to them. Why not? I've decided I'm going to make my fortune this way. The times would settle when Pontiac's rebellion was finished in 63 and 64. My first wife, Elizabeth, passed on. At that point, we had 5 children. Let's see. Mary was the first one, Johnny, then David, and then William, and then Elizabeth, named after my wife. Elizabeth did not survive birth. William William did not make it long into this world either. He was only 5 when he passed. The other 3 would manage to live into adulthood. My oldest daughter, you might find this rather interesting. I don't know how your history is, but my oldest daughter would marry William McClay. And he and I were rather connected, and so he was around the house quite often, and I think they were smitten with each other. Yes. So those 3 would survive into adulthood. I would remarry. Mary Reed was her name. Mr. Reed lives out near the Indian Gap, and where there's a Indian town there. And so Reed's Fort, as a matter of fact, is out that way. He has a fort there. And I knew his daughter Mary, and was rather fascinated by her. And so my wife Elizabeth passed away early in '64, and by the end of the year, needing a woman at the house, I married again. We would go on to have 11 children. Yes. 5 would reach adulthood of the 11. Of the 11, 6 of them would not survive infancy. Welcome to the frontier. Yes. I am not alone in this grief of losing children. It is a common thing among all of us here on the frontier. And so I remarried. I decided that I was going to build a proper house because I had made a small fortune trading back and forth to Philadelphia, to Reading town, to Lancaster town. And so having made my fortune, I decided to build the house. Well, we quarried all the stone right here in the region, not far from the house, and decided that I would have, you would have to travel to Philadelphia to find a more imposing structure than the one I would build here on the frontier. My purpose was to establish myself and to establish Harris's Ferry. I thought it important to, if we're going to make this the second most beautiful and most populated town in all of the colony of Pennsylvania, at which at this point Lancaster has us beat, then we had some work to do. And so I decided that I was going to put my efforts full-fledged into my position. So I built the house out of the beautiful gray stone here, which is a part of our great colony of Pennsylvania. Having the work to do of farming and trading and managing, people were starting to move west into the frontier. And if they wanted to move west, they had several options to go across the Susquehanna. I mentioned Mr. Clark and his ferry north of me. My ferry was the central ferry in the colony of Pennsylvania, and then below me is Mr. Wright's ferry. And so if you are traveling from Lancaster town to Yorktown, you would travel across Mr. Wright's ferry. But if you're going to Carlisle or if you're going west, you're traveling on my ferry. And so we had a very populated place. And then it happened again, war. I was in opposition, to be quite honest with you, and as much as it pains me to say that, my parents were from Yorkshire, England. I had no argument with our sovereign. The taxes that we were paying were not exorbitant whatsoever. Representation, now that was a whole different story. We did not feel represented. I understand that those Sons of Liberty you thought I was going to say something else. Sons of Liberty up in Boston were troublemakers. I did not find myself in that same position. There were no British soldiers marching down any one of the pathways. The King's Road was not populated by soldiers here in the frontier of the colony of Pennsylvania. Even Philadelphia at this time was rather free to trade and barter and live and exist without the pressure of a British soldier anywhere to be seen. All of my interaction with British soldiers were all positive. Colonel Clapham was here and designed Fort Hunter, Fort Halifax, Fort Augusta, Fort Loudon. We were in great connection with the British soldiers, and I found myself as a British subject, and I saw myself as a loyal British person. Well, I argued against independence at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. I was not alone. There were many Pennsylvanians who did not like the idea of war. We knew that it would be devastating. We knew that we would be, with Philadelphia being where it's at, we knew we would be in the middle of the mess. And so I stood against it, but Mr. Franklin had his way, did he not, with the delegation to the Continental Congress. I was in Carpenter's Hall in June of 1776, arguing against independence. Mr. Franklin was in the State House just down the street arguing for independence. Meanwhile, both Johnny and David had signed up and had already been serving since 75. They had already gone with Montgomery and with Arnold to Quebec. That did not turn out so well, by the way. We can talk about that if you wish. The British were waiting for us. Many of our men, Montgomery being one of them, died outright on the very first blast given to us by the British. My son Johnny was injured there, made his way back to Fort Ticonderoga after being released by the British, and then would sign up again with the 12th Pennsylvania later on in 76. So here we are. Philadelphia is abuzz with this thing that Jefferson has done, right? Well, not just Jefferson, let's be honest. He had some help, right? Do you know all 5 of the individuals? Anybody? Adams, yes, quite right, yes. Well, John Hancock's signature is on there, but he didn't help write it, interestingly enough. He was actually the president of the Congress at the time, Mr. Hancock, yes. All right, so, yeah, Adams and Jefferson.
Didn't Adams help draft a lot of it?
That it is true that Adams, I think, whispered in the ear of Jefferson quite honestly and quite often many of the words that ended up in the document. So Franklin was a part of the delegation. Livingston?
Madison?
No. And Stewart was the other. 2 individuals you hardly ever hear about, right? Stewart and Livingston, right? Yeah. Hardly ever hear of those 2. Well, it's because Jefferson won the day and was given the responsibility of the final draft that would go to Congress, Continental Congress. And then, of course, they would do great damage, I think in his words, do great damage to my document. But that being said, we now have this declaration. Reading the declaration, it came to me in the Gazette, the Pennsylvania Gazette. It was delivered to my house on the 16th of July. And on the front page of the Pennsylvania Gazette was the entirety of the declaration written there on the front page. And so I read the declaration there at my home. And I went into my wife and I said, Mary, I shall throw my efforts into the cause. My nation has made this decision. I shall go along with them. And I said to Jack, saddle up the horses tomorrow morning, first thing, 3 o'clock in the morning. We shall take off at 4 and make our way to Philadelphia. And I put 3,000 pounds of ready money in the saddlebags. 3,000 pounds of ready money. Right, I heard that. Somebody said, geez. Right. The average income in my day is somewhere between 100 and 200 pounds a year. I had 3,000 pounds of ready cash at my home I was willing to give to the Continental Congress. And so Jack and I, one of my Negroes, we took off first thing 4 o'clock on that morning and made our way to Philadelphia that night at 9 p.m. And the next morning I went to Continental Congress and delivered 3,000 pounds of ready money to show them that I was fully invested in the cause. I was given an honorary captain position. I had been a captain during the French and Indian War. And at 50 years old in 1776, I was not going to take the field of battle as a captain. So they gave me an honorary position. You know how they do, right? They do these kinds of things. But I was given the responsibility of recruiting and supplying the Army. So I was a recruiting and supply captain here on the frontier. So that's how I spent my time during the Revolution, supplying men and our troops with goods, with fabric, with forage for animals and such, that I could take down the King's Road to places like Valley Forge, Princeton, Germantown, and so on. So that's how I managed my way through the American Revolution, from one who was insistent that we should not get involved in this quarrel to one whose two sons would both be officers under Thompson's battalion, and my son Johnny, injured and almost gravely injured and almost mortally wounded, did survive at Paoli, but would never be the same. He would never fully recover. So, to suggest that we had invested ourselves in the cause was to say the least. But when the war was over, we all breathed a heavy sigh. Thank God for General Washington. Thank God for the cause. Thank God that we are now independent. But now the journey begins, right? Figuring out how we shall govern ourselves. And that would come in 1787 with a document, once again, rallying all the great men from all the colonies. Prior to that, we would have the Articles of Confederation, which would do their best, but we would need more than that. And so from that document in 87, we would get our first president, Mr. Washington. You remember that lieutenant colonel that I didn't know anything about that fellow? Yes, now he's president in 89. Go figure, we now have a president, our first one. I'm very proud of the situation and honored to be here and to serve in these days. What fascinating days to be involved and engaged in government. I would push my son-in-law, Mr. McClay, into government as well. He did not like the idea, but I didn't really give him a chance. And so he and I, we've formed this connection together that would allow us to draw up the environment of what we would name no longer Harris's Ferry or Paxton, but we would now name it Harrisburg. And so we sent this document down to the Pennsylvania Congress and said we would like to establish the city of Harrisburg, and we would like it to be the city or the seat of government for a new county. For you see, up until 1785, we're to the Susquehanna River, we are Lancaster County. That means every bit of business you do must be done in the courthouse in Lancaster County. That's a day's ride. And it's just not convenient anymore. There's way too many people moving west, way too much business and commerce here in the frontier that I can't go to Lancaster that often to do business. We need a new county, and we need a county seat right here, and that was our petition in 1785. And the Congress of Pennsylvania granted our petition. And so, Dauphin County and its seat, Harrisburg. Never mind Mr. McKean, who argued that it should be named Louisburg. For you see, Dauphin is the pet name of the son of the King of France, the Dauphin. And so we decided, because of the French and their work during the American Revolution, we decided to honor the French and to name the county after the Dauphin, the son of the King of France. Well, one of my staunch enemies said, well, if we're going to name the county after the Prince of France, then we should name the county seat after the King, King Louis. And so we should name it Louisburg, of which I said, we shall not name it anything other than Harrisburg, or I shall not give you the land. I won the day. Yes, quite right. So I attest even to this very day that my insistence was that it would be named after my good father who received the grant from William Penn and not myself. For humility should be a trait all of us endeavor to make a high priority. That being said, by the time Mr. Washington becomes president in '89, we have established ourselves as Dauphin County. Harrisburg is the county seat. I have given land at this point for a courthouse, a fine courthouse. Oh, we have a pillory, by the way. Have you seen it? It's down between the courthouse and the river, right there. And yes, we can put prisoners there. It's rather fascinating. We have our own pillory. I've given land for a church, so that we might have an official church. My own congregation is Paxton Presbyterian. That's where I attend worship services, but there is the need for a church inside the city of Harrisburg, and so I gave the land for that as well. And we are moving quite steadily along. And my hope that I had shared this with my son-in-law, Mr. McClay. I said, it is my hope that here we are, 1790, on the edge of 1791. And it is my hope that the government seat here in Pennsylvania would do as they had done in New York and as they had done in Virginia, that they would move west. In New York, they moved to Albany. Do you remember? Right? New York out to Albany. And then in Virginia, it was right in the middle of the American Revolution, they moved from Williamsburg out to Richmond. And it was my contestation that we should do the same here in Pennsylvania. We should move from Philadelphia, that the seat of government should move here to Harrisburg. That is my staunch desire, that I should see the seat of government, because you see, Harrisburg is the hub of our entire state. It is the central piece. Everything comes to Harrisburg, and then from Harrisburg goes everywhere else throughout our entire state. I apologize. It was colony for a very long time. And so here we are. We should move government. But I would not see it in my own lifetime. For that very same year in 1791, I came down with an illness, and 2 weeks later they were placing my cold body above my two previous wives, one on top of the other, at Paxton Presbyterian Church graveyard. I suspect resurrection morning shall be rather interesting for me. Having one wife and then the next wife and then myself on top of the two of them, resurrection morning shall be rather fascinating. We shall see, right? But here we are. We have done what we had hoped to do, and it is come to my hearing that some years later, wisdom would prevail, and they would eventually move the entire seat of government from Philadelphia here to Harrisburg. Is this true? Can you confirm it? Yes. Oh, good. Very good. Well, then here we are, here in Paxton. Well, even Paxton is developing and growing so rapidly that they're beginning to subdivide Paxton. North Paxton, South Paxton, upper and lower, and east and west. And so here we are. And seated here in this place, I find us to be the central place. And it is my hope that maybe one day this place would be the seat of government for all of our colonies, right here in Harrisburg. That might be adventurous to think such a thing, but it is not beyond me to divest my thought to you this night. Well, that includes my life, and so for a moment, here's what I shall do next. I shall ask if there are any questions that you might have of John Harris.
Did George Washington ever travel to your ferry or use your ferry?
Yes.
All right.
during the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, 3 years after my death. Yeah. So we never met in person. We corresponded during the French and Indian War. I let him know where all the natives were located, the friendly and the unfriendly ones. So I corresponded with Mr. Washington, but we had never met in person.
Did he sleep in your house?
Did he sleep in my house? I don't know. That's a very good question. I maybe when I get there I'll ask him. Yes, right. Another question, sir.
You mentioned that you traveled to Philadelphia with your Negro.
Yes.
Did John Harris have slaves?
We had 6, sir. Yes, 3 women and 3 men. Yes. My father had 5, the most famous of which is Hercules. But many of those had either passed on or we negotiated a different place for them to live out their days. But by the time I get to my last will and testament, I have 6. As a matter of fact, by the time we get to 1780, I don't know if you know this or not. I hope you do. Pennsylvania is the very first very first state to adopt a gradual manumission of Negroes and mulattoes from slavery to freedom. We are the first state to do so. We do it in 1780. I was part of that process when I was serving in government in Philadelphia. And so we drafted up a document of gradual manumission, so that by the time you reached a certain age, if you were born into slavery because of your mother, or if you were a slave in 1780, that you would eventually be released by the age of 26. Either way. So we are the first colony. Pennsylvania is the first colony to do so. I think we forget some of our history conveniently sometimes, right? But yes, so all of my servants, all of my Negroes are in my last will and testament, sir. 2 of them I release completely because they are infirmed or aged. I release them to the obligation of my son and daughter. 2 of them are given to my son and daughter to care for until they are manumitted out into freedom. And there is money provided for all 4 of them. And then the last 2 are given to one of my grandsons, who was given the responsibility to care for them and also then to release them in due time. So they're all given, each one of them is given a sum of money to care for them perpetually, especially old Jack. Old Jack is, oh my heavens, he is ancient. And so I financially care for him completely. Yeah. So yes, slavery is alive and well in the frontier in our colony. There are, let's see, in 1780 we are required, because of the Gradual Manumission Act, we are required to list down in the courthouse in Lancaster, we are required to list all of the Negroes in our household. There are 26 slaves in Harris's Ferry in 1780. There are 26 who are owned and living in Harris's Ferry, or Paxton at the time, in 1780. Yes. Other questions you might have? I can't see back here, so.
Hold on one second.
Okay.
Could you we have to use a microphone.
Oh, good. Yes. Yes. Quite definitely. Yes. Thank you. Sir.
Oh, I could yell.
You could yell. Yes. Of course.
Mr. Harris, what about the relations between the natives,
Yes.
the Indians? Do they generally get along? I mean, if a hunting party crosses your ferry, are they fair game for the next hunting party, or do they get along?
You're asking an incredibly interesting question. And I say incredibly interesting because it really does depend on the month and the year and the season. What we have discovered about the natives is that there's a constant state of flux that is happening between tribal relations that will eventually, for example, the Iroquois nations gobble up the Conestogas and the Susquehannocks, and they're going to eventually gobble up the Lenni Lenape and the Delaware. But at one point, all of those tribes were opposed to each other, and now they're all a part of the Six Nations of the Iroquois. They're all bound together by contract, so to speak. At one point, you might run into an Onondaga, a small band of Onondagas, who are aligned with a group of Shawnee, who then are on their way south to raid the Cherokee. And so they'll cross the Susquehanna at Harris's Ferry, head down south, do a raid on the Cherokee, and then come back with all their goods that they've managed to get a hold of. It really, and it's hard for us as whites to understand what kinds of things are going on tribally from moment to moment, month to month, year to year. I can tell you at best, when treaties are signed, that's when we know the most, because we have the chiefs, they're sitting around the table, and that's when we can get caught up on everything. But within 2 to 3 months, some of those treaties are null and void. Somebody's broken the treaty, whether it's the Pennsylvania government has broken the treaty, or some of the frontiersmen have broken the treaty, or some of the Indians have broken the treaty. So either way, a treaty can only last as long as those who are maintaining it through their integrity, so to speak. So at any given time, that being said, I can tell you quite honestly that at my house and at our trading post, we rarely have had difficulty. During the French and Indian War, we had threats. But other than that, we've had nothing but peaceful interaction with the natives at my house and at our trading post. I hope that answers your question. Good. I don't know how much time we have, so somebody needs to flag or do it. Other questions? Other questions? There's a question way over here, and there's a question here. Yes. Good.
Did you know a gentleman named Andrew Berryhill?
Yes.
What
Mr. Berryhill is younger than myself.
There was the father, senior, and then junior.
Right.
What do
yeah.
you know about him?
Well, they live here in Paxton. So there are in 1790 there's about 2,000 people who are living here, and so I don't know everyone as well as I would like. And Mr. Berryhill is one of them. I know that he's doing well for himself, along with the likes of Mr. Rutherford, and there are several others who are in that position. They're doing well. I trade with them on occasion, but for the most part, they're industrious enough that we don't interact very often. So I can't tell you that I know very much. I apologize.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you're most welcome. Except that he's a nice fellow.
That's good.
Yes. There's a question here.
Yeah, can you speak to the necessity for a license to trade with the natives? What was the reason for that, and what was the government trying to control?
Sure, that's a most excellent question. The government is trying to control primarily the sale of weaponry to natives. So tomahawks, muskets and rifled pieces, flints, gunpowder, and such. For the most part, that's the primary reason. The secondary reason that there's control is that, how do I want to say this? There's no delicate way to say it. The Pennsylvania government wanted to make sure that it knew exactly how much of their resources were going into the hands of natives. The best way to do that is to make sure they knew who was trading with the natives and to keep that at a limited number. It was a way to monitor and a way to evaluate the power and strength of the native communities through the trade individuals like myself, who, you know, if I'm ordering more goods, the question would be, why are you ordering more? Have you? So I'm expected to keep logbooks and record books on how much I'm trading, whether it's with frontier individuals, people moving west, or whether it's with natives. I'm expected to report what I'm doing in the area of trade. So my logbooks are filled with notations of trading with natives. And I think it's this idea of trying to understand the enemy alongside of trying to understand the ally, that sometimes natives found themselves in one of those positions or the other. So for example, we were allied with the Iroquois Nation during the French and Indian War. During the American Revolution, the Iroquois Nation sides with the British. And now we're at war with the Iroquois Nation. Right. So it's really important to know who's trading with those folks and to monitor that and to control it. When it's out of control, such as the incident with the black boys down near Fort Loudon, when it's out of control like that, the government's only responsibility is to come in and shut it down. And they did in that event. Right. Other questions?
Mr. Harris, we have a question back here.
Yes.
Mr. Harris, you spoke about Conrad Weiser
Yes.
earlier.
Yes, good friend, yes.
He also happens to be an ancestor of mine.
Oh,
So what I was wondering, in your acquaintance with him,
yes.
did you ever meet his Indian wife?
I knew her well. Of course, yes, I was at Weiser's house most often. Usually when we would do trade work, he came to my place, or we would meet somewhere common ground. But yes, I was at his house multiple times, stayed there at his house. When traveling, if I could keep from staying in a tavern, I would. If you've ever stayed in a tavern, it's not necessarily all that pleasant. I have a few that I like to frequent, and they usually reserve a room for me because I can afford it. But I would rather stay with Mr. Weiser or friends, and so yes, I've stayed at the house several times. Yes. So you're a relation, are you? Oh my heavens! I hope you have some of the same fervor. Yes. I would call it spunk, maybe. Yes. Foolish. Is that what somebody said? Okay. Right, yeah. Other questions? Are there any?
Well, we know young George liked cherry bombs. What's your favorite drink?
Pam?
Mine is Madeira. Yes, of which I am enjoying some tonight. I bring my own. I heard you have none here.
Mr. Harris,
Yes.
if there's not any other questions, I'd like to end this with this question.
Yes.
So you had some slaves that would travel with you.
Yes.
What was the reception or perception between the slave and the Native Americans?
Oh, interesting question. Yes, of the six, I had three. There were three women, and they all cared for the inside of the house and all of the things that my wife and children would need. And then I had three men who would either run the ferry when I was gone or travel with me. I would pick and choose at any given moment. Because of that, I educated my servants. I needed them to know what to do when in my absence. The best way to know how to charge somebody a ferry fee was to know how to do math. And so I had to teach them how to write down the fee, how to charge that fee and collect it, and how to be able to count. And so it was important that I would educate. I was also fond of educating children, in 1785, we started the Harrisburg Academy. And then in my last will and testament, I left enough money so that it would continue after I was gone. But your question is one of great interest, because natives saw Negroes in an interesting position. They weren't natives, they weren't Indians, and they weren't whites. They would come across Negroes who were free, and they would interact obviously with many who were slaves. And now Indians understood slavery. They had been enslaving each other for thousands of years, by the way, the native folk. During the French and Indian War, when I mentioned that 600 are taken, they're taken into slavery. Now, some of them migrate and become a part of the tribe, but some of them are just used as servants to the natives who had taken them. So tribal slavery had been happening for a long time, so they understood the concept, if that makes sense, of enslaving another individual of which you had conquered. What they couldn't understand was enslaving somebody that you had purchased. Conquering somebody meant that they are now yours. Buying somebody meant you're paying somebody for another human life. That's where it didn't make sense. But other than that, they understood the concept of slavery, and there were Negroes who had been captured and taken off and put into slavery in tribal communities. There were unlimited number of interactions between natives and Negroes. To answer your question fully and completely, we would have to have one of them here to answer that. I think I've exhausted the thought myself.
That's very interesting.
So let's do this. What if I'm not John Harris anymore? What if I'm just Dave? Do you have any questions for me, the guy who plays John Harris and who wrote the book? And the reason, by the way, the reason I wrote the book, feel free, if you want a copy, we'll make that happen. But that's not why I'm here. After I started reenacting this individual's life, interpreting this individual's life, about almost 20 years ago now. By accident, completely by accident, the Dauphin County Historical Society was looking for somebody to do a dog and pony show fundraiser. And they contacted the reenacting group that I'm a part of, the Donegal Township Riflemen, and they asked if there was anybody who would be willing to show up at their winter event, their big fundraiser, and walk around pretending to be John Harris. Well, there was $25 involved, and I said, sure. So I went down and I walked around, and what you need to know is I have two really favorite places in life. One of them is Walt Disney World. The other is Colonial Williamsburg. I've had the luxury of I have 3 kids. I've had the luxury of having 2 of my children work at those places. So you get in for free when you have family there, by the way. It's just been, it just kind of grew, but I wanted to do, if I was going to do this, I wanted to do it at the Colonial Williamsburg level. And that's not what they were looking for, at least that night. And so they asked me if I would do it again, and I said, no, thank you. And they said, why not? I said, well, if you're looking for somebody to walk around, you can go down to Theater Harrisburg, and somebody will dress up and walk around and pretend to be John Harris. That's great. But if you're looking for somebody to interpret his life, I'd be interested in having a conversation with you. 2 weeks later, I got a phone call. And 4 weeks later, I was sitting at a table twice as long as this one with a set of white gloves on and everything that they had that was John's. And they said, take as much time as you want. So for the next 30 hours, not consecutive, but for about 30 hours, I combed through every piece that I could find. And then I went to the state archives, and I went to State Museum, I went to the State Library, I went to lots of other places, and exhausted all the information I could find about John Harris. And then I started researching what other people said about John Harris. like Conrad Weiser, like Christopher Gist, like George Washington, who mentions Harris as they're communicating back and forth with Montour, Andrew Montour, and things like that. And so I had all of this information collected. I had this ring binder collected of all this information about John Harris. And so I go and do presentations, and people would say, well, where did you get all this information? Can we buy this information? Is there a book? And I was like, no, there's no book. I've got a ring binder at home, but there's no book on this. I pulled it from all of these different places. Now, I'm a part of a first-person interpreter national organization. I'm very good friends with a lot of first-person interpreters from Plymouth Plantation, Old Sturbridge Village, Colonial Williamsburg, and places like that, where you dive into character and stay there. And that's a craft. It's theatrical as much as it is historical. Because when you dive into a character at that level, you really have two people bouncing around inside of you at any given moment. I have to know everything that John Harris knew in order to sit here with confidence and speak to you. Because you could say, well, who was the governor in '64? You would know who the governor was in '64 if we're talking 1964. Some of you would know that. Some of you would be like, I was a kid, I don't know. But John would have known because he would have interacted with Morris, who was the governor. So I have to know who the governor is in '64. I have to not only know who the governor is in '64, I have to know what I'm doing in '64 in relationship to the governor, and what Conrad Weiser's doing, what a British pound is worth in 1764, and what kinds of events are happening up and down the colony that I'm reading in the Pennsylvania Gazette in 1764. That's just 1 year. He lives 65 years, from 1727 to 1791. So he experiences almost the entirety of the 18th century, right? 1727 to 1791, that's almost the entire 18th century. And so there are lots of things that happen. There are all kinds of things in finance. There are all kinds of things, two major world wars, both the French and Indian and the American Revolution. There's lots of small skirmishes. There's this whole thing where there are Connecticut people who think they own part of Pennsylvania up in the north. There's a whole thing where there are Maryland people who think they own part of Pennsylvania, and so they contract Mason and Dixon to draw a line. I've got to know all about that because that affected his business. I've got to know things about the Susquehanna River. Like there's a set of falls south down around Blaine that you cannot navigate a boat over. And so he's in this constant state of consternation that he can't get goods down to the Chesapeake. He would have loved to have gotten goods down to the Chesapeake, because if he can get goods to the Chesapeake, if he can get goods down to what is now Elkton, Maryland, that's the mouth of the start of the Chesapeake off the Susquehanna. In my day, it's called a head of elk. If he can get goods there, he can get them on boats, and he can get them all over the world. And his business just goes from here to here then, all of a sudden. So he's got to do all of his work down at Philadelphia. He's restricted in that sense. I've got to know why he's restricted and why he goes to Philadelphia all the time. Not only that, I have to know that he was baptized in Christ Church a year after he's born, 11 months actually, almost to the day, in the same baptistry that is there today. You can go visit the baptistry that John Harris was baptized in Christ Church in Philadelphia. Right. So it's really fascinating to play a part like this. Because when somebody raises their hand and has a question, let me tell you, I am as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs, right? Because I have no idea what they're going to ask, and I have no idea. I know he knew Berry Hill, I just don't know how much he knew him. So you got my standard answer. I know him. I know he's a nice guy. I know I interact with him. Right, and I know he's a solicitor, right? And actually, I think he's a barrister as well. So I know bits and pieces, but not enough that I really want to converse, and I don't want to get something wrong. I don't want to say, well, I know he's a barrister, I know he's a solicitor, I know he's a nice guy, he's got a good reputation in those, which is not easy to do, by the way, in those fields, to have a good, right, yeah, right, yes. Yeah, so, right, now that you say that, I remember reading that.
I have a question back here.
Yeah, sure.
Did John Harris, you talked about Washington, maybe having been there. Were there any other luminaries of that time who did visit John Harris?
Franklin was at Harris's several times. Primarily prior to the French and Indian War, Franklin was in charge of placing all of the forts on the frontier. That was one of his jobs in the Pennsylvania government early on. So in 1748, 1749, Franklin comes west into the frontier and says, well, we need a fort here, and that's Fort Loudon, and we need a fort here, and then we need a fort up here, and we need a fort over here. And he just, he makes this perimeter of forts that if you stand back on a map of Pennsylvania, there's this entire perimeter from what we now know is somewhere around Easton, down through Bethlehem, down to Reading, over to the Susquehanna, and down the western shore of the Susquehanna. And those are all positioned by Franklin. He is in Philadelphia at the same time as the Continental Congress. So our assumption is that he runs into people, but we don't. He never mentions it. So I have to go off the fact that he may have, but he doesn't mention it. So, if he went to City Tavern on any given night, he probably would have run into, or at least looked across the room and saw Adams and Jefferson and all these other individuals sitting there. He is Benjamin Rush and Dickinson are two individuals that he mentions. Dickinson is going to start Dickinson College here in Pennsylvania. So he serves with both of them in government. Yeah. So yeah, there are some individuals like that. What we would call second-tier patriots. It's wonderful. The guy who does George Washington, the senior George Washington down in Colonial Williamsburg, his name is Ron Carnegie. Ron wrote the foreword to my book, and he said, "This is the generation. This is the John Harris level. Those are the workhorses of America. Jefferson and Adams and those guys are sitting in Philadelphia and they're writing. They're writing what it's going to look like and how it's all going to get figured out. Harris is making it happen. He's on the ground. He's boots on the ground kind of guy. And that's probably one of the reasons I really like him, is because he is boots on the ground. He's a real guy. He loves his hunting dogs. He loves fishing. He loves hunting. He tells great stories in some of his journals and some of his record books that are fabulous to take a look at. He is a man who's not he's not unaware of hardship. He's a fantastic businessman, and he makes a fortune. Literally in 1776, to have 3,000 pounds sitting at your house that you're willing to give to Congress, that's the money he's willing to get rid of. That means he has more than that, right? I mean, if you're going to give money to the government, you're not going to give them everything you got, right? Even if it is a war, and even if your heart's in it, you're not going to give them everything you got. So he gives them 3,000 pounds at a time period when most people are making 100 to 200 pounds a year. So think about that. He's making thousands of pounds a year at fur trading, at managing goods. He is the middleman to the entire frontier. Everything comes to Harris's Ferry. He's got 13 outbuildings. He's storing everything at Harris's Ferry. Then he's piling them on pack horses and Conestoga wagons, taking them down to Philadelphia and selling them to boat captains who are taking them then to France and England. And he's making a killing doing it. It's amazing how much money this man has. He's going to build the Greystone house down on Front Street, which, by the way, he's quarrying all the stone at the quarry out by Rutherford House. Do you know where I mean? Yeah, this is the Greystone quarry out by Rutherford House across from what's near the old Harrisburg Mall. I say the old, isn't that weird to say that, right? The old Harrisburg Mall, because it's not there anymore. That's where he's getting all of his Greystone, out there at Rutherford's. So he's, which, by the way, he quarries it and donates it for the building of Paxton Presbyterian Church as well. You'll notice it's the exact same Greystone. Paxton Presbyterian Greystone is the same Greystone as his house, because he's quarrying it and donating it to the building of Paxton Presbyterian Church. Yeah, right. Small world, right? Yeah. Isn't that fun to know? It's like, oh, that's what, historians geek out on stuff like that, right? That's like, oh my gosh. Which, by the way, there are Indian caves all out through there. That's a whole nother story. Most of them have been blacktopped over, but there are Indian caves all out where the Harrisburg Mall is at. I would love to have access to all that, by the way. Yeah, yeah.
Quick, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey,
Harris have any interaction with William Pitt? Like you made that statement earlier that Harrisburg was going to be the second biggest city.
Right.
So Pittsburgh didn't really get cooking until like 1760 or 1770.
That it's not cooking even then. It's still considered the Western frontier well into it's a frontier fort during the American Revolution. It's an outpost. If you're sent to Pittsburgh, you did something wrong as a Continental soldier. But it is considered. The British are trying to work their way around from Canada through the upper lake area, and so it's an important place, a boundary, so to speak. So, but even at that point, Pittsburgh is really just an outpost and a fort. It's not going to take off until after the Rev War.
So who is William Pitt? Do you have any interaction?
Pitt is in England, and he is the chair of Parliament at the time when they name Fort Pitt. He is the that's terrible, brain fart. He is whoever's in charge of Parliament, whatever the person is. If Harris can have senior moments, he's allowed, right? Yes. There you go. So yeah, William Pitt is one of the. He is the head person of Parliament in the day, right? That's where the name comes from. Yeah.
Dave,
Yes.
quick question.
Yeah.
All right, this is to Dave Biser,
Oh,
not
good.
to John Harris.
Okay. Good. Yeah.
In the years that you've been who you are, married, children, and so on,
Yeah.
how many times do you find your persona of John Harris sort of, I don't know how you want to say it, taking over during a daytime
Sure.
whatever?
Oh, that's a great question. So right before I got here, my wife and I were Skyping with our grandsons in Florida, and of course they're used to me looking like this already. My oldest grandson's 3 years old, and he's like, oh, Pop-Pop's going out to have fun. So he's used to it. My middle child, daughter, worked at Colonial Williamsburg for 5.5 years. She was in the reenacting unit with me as a child. Well, all three of my kids, I did something different with all three of my kids, that they had one-on-one time with Dad. And this particular daughter, it was reenacting. My son, it was computer games, and my other daughter, it was soccer. And none of them were allowed to take Dad time when it was their thing. Like, none of them were allowed to play soccer so you get it. So she did the reenacting thing. So it spilled over into her life as well. So she did it. Still has an interest. She married a man that she met at Colonial Williamsburg, so he's got it too, the history bug. It does kind of spill over. If you walk into my house, half of the house is decorated like you were in the 18th century. I've got 3 outbuildings. My backyard has pea gravel and oyster shell pathways, just like they would have back then. I have a leather shop and a tavern out in the backyard. So yeah, it's kind of fun. It does spill over a little. Yeah.
And a horse.
And a horse. Yes, and a horse. Yeah, about 4.5 years ago, I finally got my first horse. That's mine. I've always ridden. I've ridden on battlefields and all that kind of stuff. But I've never had my own, and so now I have my own horse. So that just takes it to a whole nother level. A couple of weeks ago, I got into the volunteer program at Colonial Williamsburg, which is not hard to do. They just simply have to vet you out and know that you're not a wacko. I think for most of us, that's always a borderline thing, right? So they found out, and so I made one of the descriptions we have of John Harris is that when this person wrote the description, he said he is a tall man of ruddy complexion. His hair is brown going gray, and he wears a brown coat, a brown waistcoat, and a pair of leather breeches. And so I contacted the leather shop in Colonial Williamsburg and said, I want to come down and spend some time in the leather shop. I want to make a pair of leather breeches. And they said, come on down. So I've had the wonderful privilege of, I mean, that's in the reenacting world, in the leather breeches world, that's the premier place to go. If you want to make a pair of leather breeches, you go to Williamsburg, because that's the only place. They've done all the research, they do all the work, and so I've sat in their shop sewing leather. The last time, that was back in August, this a couple weeks ago, right? I told the church that I pastor, I said, we're going to go hard to Easter, and then on Monday morning I will be in Williamsburg for the week. And so I went back down again, and I volunteered the entire week in the coach and livestock department. Because I have a horse, I'm very comfortable around horses, so I got a chance to hitch up all the horses for the carriage rides every day, and do all that kind of stuff. So groom the horses, hitch them up, and all the tack and everything. Got a chance to ride with some of the guys and got to know the carriage drivers really well, and all of that kind of stuff. So it was a lot of fun. Got to club one of the new lamb's tails. They nipped the tail off because sheep don't need a long tail, and they come out with a longer tail than I expected. Like, what the heck? They like, yeah, that's not going to last. We're going to cut that off. You want to help? And I said, yes, sure. So, yeah. So it's in the reenact. I've done a bunch of movies, which is really fun until you realize you're going to stand around and do a lot of nothing for a really long time. But I was in HBO's John Adams, Liberty. I got an opportunity to do The Patriot and had to pass it up because it was 3 weeks right before Easter. And I had to be in South Carolina for 3 weeks. And I was like, I'm a pastor, I can't do that. They're like, oh, okay, moving on then. That would have been fun to do. So, but the nice thing about everything I wear, I hand stitch. So reenacting at this level, you can walk right onto a movie set and you're good to go, which is kind of cool. So there's a whole level of reenactors that we get called when they do movies. Can you like turn, things like that? Get to be extra back in the background and do that kind of stuff. So for TV shows and movies, kind of fun.
Well,
yeah. We've been here a while.
I would love to go on, but what I would like to do is, Dave has his book over here if you would like to purchase it. I know a lot of us are going to be purchasing one tonight, so we can do that, but I have to bring this meeting to an end. If you don't purchase it tonight, it's for sale, I know, on Amazon and such, so.
State Museum, State Museum's covering it. And it looks, we're finalizing everything for Midtown Scholar to carry it. It's available on Barnes & Noble, on Amazon, so all those places you can find it out there.
Fantastic. And it's nice that it's actually in a showcase at the State Museum.
Yeah, it is.
So, I mean, what an honor.
Right.
So, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
With that, I'd like to take a motion to end.
I make a motion to end the meeting.
Second? I'll see you then.